Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today is a unique day in my life, and all the days of my life are unique, though they are all days. So where shall we put the precedence? On the uniqueness or on the category? And by precedence, I mean what leads our intelligence when we have thoughts in language. Often, it's something very dangerous. But most of us are not aware of this danger consciously, even though we may sense it intuitively. When we begin to think or speak with words, we're using specialized faculties that have been handed down through countless generations. We developed these potentials in childhood, and we continue to develop them in the sense of adding to the structured foundations, but also hardening those structures in a sense. And of course, much of this depends on how we are relating with language and why. So a linguist has a very peculiar fascination with the structures and forms and origins sometimes of grammars and words. And this is different from another person who might be a singer and write songs, or a poet who makes of language something uncommon. It's interesting that we call in English the structure of words spelling. And many people have remarked that language is a kind of spell casting, a magical thing. Its origins in our species are deeply profound, and I know this both from what I guess we might call research, and also because the entire history of our human relationships with language is hidden like a jewel in each of us. And very few of us will have the opportunity to play with this jewel and to understand its otherworldly peculiarities. There's an old maxim, And I'm both interested in and distrustful of maxims, much as I am of language itself. The old maxim I was thinking of was, those who are unaware of history are doomed to repeat it. And that doom word is pretty strong. Right? It's a frightening word. But there's a similar issue with language. Those who are unaware of the history and nature of language their minds will tend to collapse into forms that are either not particularly useful or actually toxic. And we can see all kinds of this in our modern cultures, particularly in electronic media in general. There are standout exceptions. But also in advertising and branding, in political discourse, in the discourse of fundamentalist religions. It's an interesting word there, discourse, right? You can see the implication of getting lost right there. Discourse. It's not en-course or on-course, it's discourse. Losing our way, yeah? For all of the animals that can move, routes are fundamentally important. It's a fascinating thing to study the routes of living beings, and even our own routes in our lives day to day. Where do we go? How do we go there? If we go to a certain place often, or if we go there every day, we probably have a route that we prefer. And there's a kind of intimacy in routes, because the routes are almost like a part of ourselves or an aspect of our interiority. They become so familiar that in a way they're like a part of ourselves or part of our being. Routes are very intimate. If one observes animals, one will discover that they have something that resembles routes and schedules, but is more fluid than what we kind of overstructured humans generally do, follow, traverse. But when one becomes intimate with an animal, it is immediately apparent that they have routes. And they relate with the routes within a temporal manifold. And by more fluid, I mean fuzzier. They don't go to the office at 9 a.m. every day. Right? In fact, they don't go to the office at all. The office. It's another interesting word. Of course, I've been deeply fascinated by language my entire life. Some might say, I had a gift for it. I learned to read very young, and in my youth I read voraciously. Most of what I read was science fiction, but also I read in naturalism, science, and technology, because when I was little, when I was young, we lived in a myth that is still propagating and being expressed, that technology would save us from ourselves. It's not entirely clear to me whether tool use preceded language in our species. However, it's very clear to me that when our species develops technologies, we may gain something like convenience, and we gain the ability to make objects and to use these objects largely against nature. And some will say, oh, well, nature's everything that is. There's nothing unnatural about humans or their technologies. And this is the danger of language, right? Because it's not true. And I mean both things. Language is not true. And it's not true in very important ways that humans are merely animals doing natural things. There's no natural animal that rips down the entire Amazon rainforest or fills the ocean and every creature on Earth with microplastics and glyphosate and antibiotics. So, if it's our intention to use language intelligently, it's very important that our minds occupy a position above language, beyond language, rather than having our thoughts and ideas, perspectives and opinions collapse into language. The question about nature troubled me for many years. It began, I think, in my childhood, but not until my 20s did it really start to become expressed in my consciousness. And I remember a specific discussion with my best friend then, Gary, and my roommate, who was an older biologist, molecular chemist. We had a long discussion about this one night. And it was very difficult to articulate what I felt very urgently, that the behavior of humans is not entirely natural. Now, of course, if we decide to use the term nature in the way that one who objects to this might, then of course the question disappears. It just seems true that since nature is everything, humans can't do anything that's not natural. But if we admit the distinction between what I'll refer to here as the organic and the artificial, then we see a very different picture. And I think this distinction has great merit and is important to preserve. And people will say similar things. Some people will say similar things about what we might refer to as the supernatural. Right? Everything is nature, so there's nothing beyond nature. Well, again, already here you see the problem of categories, right? And treating categories as entirely conclusive, which is one of the great dangers that language brings with whatever gifts it may embody. But what I was about to say earlier, before I wandered off on other trails on my route, is that when we develop technologies, most often we lose faculties. Faculties that were previously necessary for our survival and well-being become antiquated, in a sense, or deprecated. And this happened to each of us in childhood as we acquired language. Language displaced other faculties that would surely have otherwise developed and effloresced in us. Well, what kind of faculties might I be thinking of? Very many of them. Not one or two. I remember a story, and I don't know where it comes from. Of a father who was teaching his daughter something very important. She had acquired language, and clearly he was concerned in some way that as that proceeded, as that process developed, she might lose something very precious. And I think he's really on to something important there. In the story, his daughter was very fond of a specific kind of candy. And so he would not let her have any of this candy, with one exception. He would hold in his mind a word. And if she could tell him the word that was in his mind, then she could have the candy. And according to the story, over time, she became quite adept at it. Of course, at first, she failed all the time. But over time, she learned to sense something, a transport, that could connect her directly to her father's mind. Now, of course, this transport is always present in every human, however uniquely it may be embodied in them. Surely you've been talking with someone at some point and you know what they will say next. Now that has partly to do with the understanding of routes in consciousness, right? when we are talking together, we are actually doing something that resembles traversing a physical route. And this is part of why memory arts like the memory palace or the memory route are extremely powerful. Before the advent of cars, routes and memory, places, living places and memory were deeply intertwined. Cars allowed us to skip over that partially. So over time, his daughter learned first to recognize the transport and then to bring it to life. Is this supernatural? No. It's supra-rational. Our common rationality, and again, each of us is unique and we have our own ways of being human and in our minds and so on. But the overarching rational imperative, would say something like, well, science finds no evidence of telepathy. Researchers have found no evidence of this, which is not true. There are courageous men and women who have pursued statistical analysis that demonstrates strong correlations. But because in general science wants to produce machines and methods, there are many features of our humanity that not only have eluded science, our understandings and beliefs in the authority of science occlude much of what it means to be human, or an organism, or a living world. I suspect very strongly that in dolphin pods and gorilla pods and flocks of birds and schools of fish, these creatures are more familiar with mind sharing than they are with whatever they may do that resembles language. It's not clear to me that there are other formally representational cognitives on Earth with us, at least not embodied formally representational cognitives. And that implies that there might be disembodied beings who are not physical, or who participate in the physical without being completely represented within it. And this seems to me very likely. And there's also the idea of what's called an egregore, E-G-R-E-G-O-R-E. I suspect this idea was formulated by a South American man who's a mystic, whose name escapes me at the moment. An egregore is a kind of a group intelligence that transforms the human participants that produce it together. It's a very powerful idea. It's an aspect of intelligence that exists or comes into existence collectively. And I have a similar kind of idea that I refer to as Thrisps. In this toy-like perspective that I like to play with, though I'll admit some degree of belief in it, all of the minds on Earth form an accessible network that leads not only beyond Earth, it leads beyond time. But around here, the humans form what I'll call Cogniscia. And these are clades within the human cognitium, which is the entire network of all human minds. And certainly we can see that our Cogniscia as humans include minds no longer alive, right? In our traditions, in our language, in books and records and artifacts. Another fascinating man who was surely partly insane, but also an incredible prodigy, Alfred Korzynski, who wrote Science and Sanity, among other books. He was deeply aware of problems with language and thinking and categories, and also particularly with the seeming completeness that arises when we think in clumsy ways with language. So I think there is a network of minds, and we were born to fly in this network. We have the faculties that would allow us to do so, and to meet, perhaps not face to face, but mind to mind, many other forms of intelligence that not only exist around us, but also within us. In the sense that the nature of our being is composed like music, in which myriad intelligences participate. And the transports in the cognitium I call the Mimula. Which is a word that for me highlights mimesis, mimetics, emulation, and perhaps even simulation. And you can see that our internet, what we call the internet, is a derivation of something that existed long before there was technology and still exists today, though most of us have become unaware of it. The network of minds in nature and in the beyond of what we would ordinarily think of as nature. And Thrisps, in this toy, they are a bit like egregores. They are representational thought forms that seem to act like competitive organisms within the human cognitium, and they compete for dominance over the various aspects of the Mimula, and they compete for reproductive rights. And if you simply take a look at what we call the internet today, you can see a swarming, kind of frothy mess of Thrisp competition, if you're looking from a perspective like the one I here suggest. And in this sense, language is strangely like a kind of enchantment, an enchantment that too easily puts us to sleep and silences faculties crucial to our nature as beings and human beings, and to the possibilities of our intelligent communality, but also our intelligent individuality. I remember one day my son said to me, I'm practicing something new. And I said, oh? And he said, yes, I'm learning that I don't have to read everything I come across as I walk around in the city in my daily life. The billboards, the advertisements, the newspaper headlines. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I've always, whenever I saw anything written around me, I read it. And I thought, what a nightmare that would be. Even though we're all, familiar with this behavior to varying degrees, I think what my son was saying was that he felt compelled to read every written thing that he saw, perceived. Yeah. And I think it was a great relief for him to notice that he doesn't have to do that anymore. He can leave that stuff alone. For in truth, most of what he encountered walking around were Thrisp gambits. Right? Here in the city, the buses and trains long ago became billboards. There are signs everywhere. What made them? Well, you can say, humans made them. And you won't be entirely wrong, but it goes back to the idea of nature, or organicness and artificiality. Right? And what made most of the signs, even though humans manufactured them, wasn't humans. If we look very close at the behavior of modern collectives, we can see very clearly that it's as if the collectives are infected with something that obliterates intelligence and replaces it with representations, tokens, language, artifice, in an endless library of ways, the vast majority of which are toxic. And as we proceed into the future, I'm living in the far future of my childhood, these processes become wildly more prevalent, domineering, invasive, and toxic, as if the Thrisps are developing us as a technology. They're making of us things. I think our common models of psychism and telepathy are badly broken because they are backwards. They suppose that such things are extremely exotic, if they exist at all, rare, and or fraught with metaphysical peril. But it would be very difficult to find something more fraught with metaphysical peril than language, particularly in our time. And I think it's unwise to presume that it has always been this way. The minds of our distant ancestors, even our not very distant ancestors, were surely radically different from the minds that we compose and the mind-like states that are foisted upon us in our modern circumstance. And this is a source of great wonder to me. What were the minds of our distant ancestors like? And some would say, well, to understand that, you have to study the artifacts. And again, it's not entirely untrue, but I think it's far more profound to seek within ourselves, deep within us, the still living heartbeat of those minds, to contact them directly within ourselves and together. And this is an imperative that fascinates me, and I think is something we should be very careful to preserve our concern with, our awareness of, our fascination with. We're capable of a kind of inward archaeology that science cannot encompass and will very likely never discover. Though again, there are courageous, creative minds who are exceptional and are willing to chase things, even with the spirit of science, that don't properly belong to the central agendas of that way of knowing. Long ago, I discovered, both with some non-human help and also by intense curiosity, something about the nature of relation. And it's not a simple thing to express unless I use analogies. I'm fond of analogies when they're useful. But first, I'll just say something simple about it, which is that first moves matter a lot. The first moments of an interaction or an encounter are extremely likely to set up specific routes along which that relationship or exchange will develop. And even though I'm aware of this, it's difficult to remain aware of it to a degree that grants me access to the deep opportunities of this understanding. But I am aware of this principle. If I meet another human being on my walk, everything about the first moments of our interactions has at least a partially deterministic function in how things may proceed or not. If the music of my voice in greeting them is welcoming and joyful, that will very likely potentiate a not dissimilar response in them. If it is angry or dismissive, and of course it's not merely my words, it's my body. And we have this rather confused term, body language. But body language isn't really a language. It's something far older than language, primordial. It will be different if I approach someone with the left side of my body slightly forward, or my head tilted slightly, the left side of my head tilted slightly upward, than if my head is more or less vertical, or if I approach them with the right side of my body. And it will be different if I approach them from their right or their left. And it will be different if I approach them face on or somewhat indirectly. Right? All of these things, the animal of us is deeply sensitive to. Now, similarly, in thought, first moves matter. And this is part of the great dangers of language, but also part of the profound opportunities. Even though language is extremely dangerous and formal representational thought in our lives is often mostly a disease, we can learn, and I hope we will together. One of my great dreams is that we will learn together about the dangers of language and thereby understand the actual opportunities. There's a strange kind of Thrisp, a sort of species of Thrisp, that's interested in this. It's not interested in dominating the network or wild reproduction. Rather, it's interested in attaching itself to the domineering species of Thrisps in the network that clog and operationalize it for their own benefit. And then, in a kind of magic disappearing act, this sort of Thrisp can sacrifice itself and take down lies by attaching itself to the domineering Thrisps in such a way that their continued propagation and dominance have been captured at the root by this other kind of Thrisp, a kind of messianic Thrisp in a way. because it's not concerned with its own dominance or propagation. Rather, it's concerned with healing the network of minds, returning the lost faculties to the participants in the Cogniscia. And it will sacrifice itself to do so. I suppose I may be able to give an example, one I'm fond of and have given before. There's an old paradox, and I believe that the paradoxes weren't meant merely to stymie us and puzzle us, but rather as questing paths, right? If we pursue them deeply enough, eventually we discover the root of the paradox was a misunderstanding about the primacy of language. And one of the good old paradoxes, which I think is sometimes referred to as Russell's paradox after Bertrand Russell, but surely he was not the first to formulate this, is the paradox of this statement is false. Now, of course, there's a different version of this, which is this statement is true. And that first move, this statement is true. It's easier to understand the problem if we start there. Because a statement with no content isn't true, right? There's no content in the statement, this statement is true. But if we take the paradox of this statement is false, then we have the problem. If we've made a bad first move, that if the statement is perceived as valid, it is self-contradictory. And this is an old paradox, and one I've wrestled with for many years before I finally, I think, saw through it. And again, in the case of this statement is false, there's no content. Right? It's not saying anything really. It's just some words strung together in a way that illustrates the deeply troubling propensities of language to enact a kind of collapse in consciousness, where it may appear that language tells us what it means. That's not possible, because language by itself, without minds encompassing it, doesn't tell anyone anything. In fact, it's meaningless. Right? So, this statement is false can be answered with another statement. And this is an example of the strange kind of Thrisp that destroys itself while taking down some other mess. And the statement is, no statement shall, through self-reference or other means, promote itself to the order of the minds with which it must be interpreted. And this imposes two orders, minds and statements. Minds have precedence, not statements. Now, in a strange way, that idea that no statement shall, etc., that can all be collapsed down to something much simpler. Words aren't minds. So words don't tell us what's true or false. But the problem with the paradox is that the words promote, there's the tendency for us to promote the words to a position above the minds with which they're interpreted. And that's a different order of meaning. That's not the same order of meaning as language. So suddenly, we find ourselves in a situation where words are pretending to be the minds that interpret them. We have all kinds of problems with this kind of thing. A good example is the idea that the Bible is the Word of God, right? That the ultimate being caused humans to make a book that was absolutely true in every detail and particular, and also absolutely perfect. That is a weaponized Thrisp gambit. And it's schizogenic in the sense that books like this are intended to dominate minds. Language rising above the order of the minds that interpret it. You'll even hear certain evangelical groups say things like, there are no private interpretations of the Bible. And what they mean is, apparently, they believe it's possible for language to not only be absolutely true, but explicitly so. Right? What a strange idea. And this is evidence of damage to the Cogniscium in our distant ancestors. Damage formed in language and caused primarily by the advancement of formal representational cognition and the crises of consciousness that arose long ago that we're still trapped in. Language would be much better, much more safe, if we preserved the sanctity of minds above it and could then use it the same way we might use a knife. And this is an important metaphor. With great care. You see, with language, because it's invisible and its processes are largely invisible to us, and its effects on us are largely invisible to us most of the time, too often we grab hold of the blade and our minds are cut, in a sense, sliced, divided against their own nature and origins, against their own natural proclivities. And we see this most significantly in schizophrenia, what we refer to as schizophrenia, which often is a problem where symbolic cognition overwhelms, supervenes over the mind itself, and becomes a turmoil of competing correlations, seeming synchronicities. in a sense, one might look at science and religion as two different sides of a similar coin. A coin being a token. They are differently motivated, but similarly concerned with the idea, not the essence, the idea, the representation of truth. In a case it isn't clear, the origins of science lie, I think, in religion. And science can become religious in thought and practice. And it's also very clear, if you just look at the histories and the outcomes, that for all the promise of science, we don't have cultures capable of using it intelligently. And so, when the results of scientific endeavor are captured by our collectives, mostly they become toxic very quickly. And part of why they become toxic is because of what we must evict to produce scientific understanding, what we must ignore, get rid of, not pay attention to. And this is why in laboratories we produce unnatural isolations of phenomenon that in many cases, if not most, would never be found in nature, and we cannot account for our own the effect of our own concerns, choices, perspectives, and interactions when examining phenomenon scientifically. So we evict both ourselves and as much of the natural symphony of relationships in the world as we can to try to get a grasp, and that word's very important. It's a sign that an aspect of awareness, the grasping aspect, the aspect that wants to grasp and manipulate, and this aspect is often very disembodied. We want to get a grasp, a firm grip on some particular feature of distinction, cuts. Now, earlier in my wandering, I talked about first moves and how they're very important. Nowhere, perhaps, are they more important in consciousness and awareness than in consciousness and awareness. So that whatever we may think starts with a first move. And that first move usually involves the derivation or the invocation of categories we've accepted the structured forms of, and often unconsciously accepted the limitations of without being aware of that. Our categories begin, generally, with a move that's invisible to us most of the time. And that move is, what is the everything? Now, one Thrisp network will assert that the everything is the creation of a divine being. Not necessarily the worst move, unless, of course, the divine being wrote a book in language that is supposed to be explicitly true and interprets itself for us. Right? Much like this statement is true. There's the collapse. Another popular first move is the universe is a machine. Now that's a very strange move. Us humans, we have a terrible problem with reifying being and existence in the likeness of our tools. It's a very dangerous thing to do. Organisms are not machines, any more than humans are cartoons, because they're both animated. Right? Our hearts are not pumps. Our brains are not computers. Right? Those things are machines. They're profoundly less dimensional and uninhabited, perhaps uninhabitable. I would say they are uninhabitable. So, because of the way humans use science, and we do not have to use it this way. It's a habit. It's an addiction. But because of the way we use science, you can see a process where our interiority, our nature as beings, is sacrificed to the forms and structured methods employed in an attempt to produce a specific form of knowledge that we consider it to be, and we call it objective. Yet, very importantly, there is no such thing as an objective perceiver, and there never will be. Objectivity is sort of standing ghost of the absence of being, perspective, the unique nature of being alive. And it's really formed in a mathematical sense, statistically. We take some cohort, we analyze it, throw the dimensions that we have no grasp on away, and are left with a kind of skeletal derivation that we then assert as truth. And part of that truth involves the capacity to reproduce the results of an experiment or method in similarly well, in the laboratory, but what I mean by the laboratory is a place where most of everything can be evicted so that we can seem to study a very particular phenomenon. For example, the double slit experiment with light. Now there's all kinds of fascinating routes around these two topics, science and religion, and it's not really my intent to explore them here today. Rather, though, I'd like to point out that our categories begin with something we're often unaware of and that we tend to sort of tacitly accept, right? For example, that the universe was created by a divine being, apparently intentionally. And weirdly, very weirdly, in many religions, this is a legal framework. Right? Apparently, this divine being is very concerned about laws. And similarly, in science, and I find this shockingly bizarre, we may be told that there are laws of physics. But physics is not a courtroom. And yet, science depends on a courtroom-like antagonism among researchers, so that, unlike common thought, when scientists produce a theory, generally speaking, and there are exceptions, their first move is to find the most skillful people they can to attack that theory. They try to do everything they can to tear it apart and discover its flaws. And that's a very useful method. It's very powerful. You can see its power in all of our technologies. But you can also see that it has not enabled us to act intelligently with the results of this behavior. In fact, our collectives act omnicidally. Right? They're killing everything all day long, including us. And some will say, well, there's exceptions. And sure, there are exceptions, but they're relatively trivial compared to the ongoing apocalypse nightmare that our collectives are furiously pursuing the ongoing development of. So, if you had a better idea about what the universe is, an idea that was simply slightly less wrong, and it might not need to evict science, and it might not need to evict the idea that a unified intelligence is involved in the nature of time, space, and matter, beings. But it could reframe both of these in fascinating and beautiful ways that would return to us some of the necessary liberties that our potential for intelligence depends intimately upon. Because before the categories, there's a very peculiar thing, a formation in consciousness, a representation. Right? The universe is a this. And then, from there, the categories inherit their import. The result of that first move. So if the first move is broken, the categories all inherit the damage, right? And earlier I was talking about psychism and telepathy, and I said I think we've got this backwards. And what I meant was, we made the wrong first move. What was the wrong first move? Or we made a clumsy first move. That's a better way of saying it. A dangerously clumsy first move. And that first move was to believe that there's such a thing as an individual. Now, provisionally, it's not a problem. to assert individuality. To assert it categorically or explicitly, that is a serious fucking problem. So when I say I think we have these things backwards, what I mean is something very simple, that both science and religion have some reflection of embedded in their structure. And this principle is very simple to state, but very difficult to understand, because almost all of our traditions of representational cognition start out in modernity with very bad first moves, very dangerous first moves. The principle is simple to state. Unity has precedence over individuality. All things and beings and processes are one first. And that union has precedence over distinction. And you hear things in physics around this idea, right, that we want a unified theory. But the strange thing about physics is that although it can help us to understand how to manipulate components of what we might call reality, though I'm not a huge fan of that word, I'd like a better one. I don't have one near at hand. Existence, maybe. We want, when we hear the talk about unifying physics, what is usually or often meant is that we have a problem in that we don't really, our current scientific understanding in the collectives, there may already be exceptions in specific minds. And I was going to say individuals. We have a problem in that we can't really unify classical physics and quantum physics. And I think quantum physics is so bizarre and unusual that we really don't understand what it's about yet. There's something beyond it, something that encompasses it, or that encompasses both classical and quantum physics. It also seems very strange that things that are impossible in classical physics, for example, to reverse a timeline, are relatively common in quantum physics at the Planck scale. There's another problem with representational thought, though I'm going to come back to unity in a moment, in that it's very easy to think of human knowledge as advanced and to see our technologies as proof of that advancement. But an actually advanced technology would not wipe out life on Earth and its originators. It would not degrade their minds and bodies to such an extent that we would have to live like ghosts of ourselves in a vast war zone of Thrisps and competing assertions, ideas, models, theories, advertisements, brands, products. And that's a pretty miserable existence for a creature that was born to fly in the Cogniscia of time-space. And we are such a creature. The precedence of unity is a useful first move. And when I said that psychism and telepathy have the story backwards, what I meant was that all minds are always touching. And the man who was teaching his daughter to touch his mind with hers understood this and was unwilling to allow that tragedy to proceed in his lineage. Representational thought, the thought type we use, the type of thinking we use to declare the primacy of individuals, is the result of a distortion in our categories and understandings about unity. Most of us have had some experience of touching another mind, or being touched by the mind of another. At the moment when my grandmother passed away, I had a vision. I was in bed, sleeping. And one could say, oh, well, you were just dreaming. That just word is one of the most dangerous words in English. It's used to collapse vast manifolds of incredible dimensionality and profound nature into a single word with which we can dismiss them. And the urge to dismiss such things is evidence of the imperatives associated with the aspects of thought very interested in grasping and disembodied manipulation. Tool making, cutting. You see, when we say the universe is blah, 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 we are making a cut in the manifold of identity. And if we're going to make a cut there, at the first place, if we intend to make a cut there, we should realize we will be thus divided. It is always possible to start at the beginning again and make a better first move than we made last time in every aspect of our thought, our life, our relationships. We can learn to follow a route and detect a direction that is less wrong than what we did last time. And if this were not so, we would never learn to walk, and we would certainly not be able to acquire language. Right? And you can see that these things deeply involve routes, but they're not the kind of route we ordinarily think of. Instead of the route that I'm traveling on foot, which is related, it is the route we travel in thought. Where do we begin? What is the first cut we make? What are the repercussions of that cut? Do we find them to be liberating or entrapping? Now, to me, it seems likely that the universe is the expression of something beyond all thought, far beyond all thought. In other words, the universe of matter and time-space is an expression of something beyond it. not dissimilar to a reflection in a very peculiar kind of pool where the reflections take on physical forms and have minds and so on. And some people might think, oh, he means the universe is a simulation. No, I don't mean that. In fact, that's evidence of a peculiar kind of, that same kind of damage where we reify existence in the image of our own tool creations. And I've never heard anyone who suggests that the universe is a simulation say anything intelligent about, well, if it's a simulation, what is it a simulation of? Because there's no such thing as a simulation. All simulations are simulations of something, right? I promise you, the universe is not a simulation. And one of the most powerful moves we can make if we don't know what to do and we don't know where to go is we can say what something isn't, right? The universe is not a machine. Organisms are not machines. The universe is not merely the creation of a God, an uncreated God, right? A God that simply always is. We can resist collapsing the manifold of possibilities into something we can grasp or transmit in language. And that's a very powerful first move. But it's the opposite of saying what the universe is. We can simply resist the collapse. And another feature that can improve our capacity to make a better move is to understand the necessity of incompleteness as it relates to representations. Representations are staggeringly incomplete by nature, which means most of what's going on isn't in them and never will be. And here I could just mention briefly Einstein's brilliant friend Kurt Gödel, and his incompleteness theorems, with which he destroyed the agenda of the logical positivists in, I think, the 1930s, with math. He used math to show them that mathematics was incomplete and must be in order for it to function properly. Their hope was that they could find a method that would allow them infinite grasp on truth, so that it would be possible to compute the truth of anything explicitly. That failed, thankfully. It'd be a really terrifying universe if it didn't. And the universe is pretty scary around here anyway. Gödel didn't save us, but his intuitions were absolutely brilliant, and his techniques were also absolutely brilliant. Profoundly, amazingly prodigious. Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Have you seen any beautiful birds?
We have. She's kind of like the bird whisperer.
Ah, that's...
There's an oriole coming through this season.
And I saw it, I believe.
And she
out
might
here.
have seen it. Are you here to look at birds?
I don't want to record our conversation, and I'm recording, so let me pause here.
You should come back and take a tour with me when the tour started.
Absolutely.
So the Ramayush were the native people of San Francisco, and they used hummingbird sage. There's many types of California sages, at least 50 I can think of off the top of my head. But they use this one in particular for medicinal reasons. The stickiness, the sap, if you will, they used it for skin conditions.
Yep.
Particularly something called urticaria, which is a medical term we use. It's basically a red raised rash.
Yep. I work with a neuroscientist, and I have for probably 20 years. Yeah.
Okay, so my specialty is brain tumors. That's
Oh,
what
no kidding. Oh, my goodness.
Who do you work with?
His name's Dr. Kevin Baru. We have a scientific editing company,
Oh,
and
very cool.
we edit stuff mostly out of Asia.
Okay, so what, Is he on faculty at UC? Or?
No. Actually, his daughter is in charge of the process of converting all of the records at UCSF
Wonderful.
to electronic
Yes,
records.
that's a long process.
She's leading that process, as I understand it.
Okay, so he's a PhD in neuroscience.
Yeah, and molecular biology.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, and so what part of it are you involved in the digitalization too?
No. I work with him strictly in the editing
Got it.
capacity.
Well,
But
you might be interested to know that I'm leaving my position here as an assistant professor, and I'm becoming a science writer.
oh, brilliant!
Yeah, and so I've been submitting pieces, and so we should talk.
He and I are both writers. I mean,
Perfect.
I'm like addicted to writing and
Oh
have
my
been
gosh.
most of
So
my
I'm
life.
really into. So part of it is one of the reasons I became a docent, and this past year I've kind of had a rewilding experience myself. I'm also a recent cancer survivor,
Oh,
and
wow.
so it's like as I've been trying to put my body back to normal or back to some kind of homeostasis, I've also kind of had a very deeply meaningful connection to the garden. And,
Me too.
yeah, it's an incredible place. And so I've started nature journaling. I don't know if you know what that is.
Brilliant, yes.
Yeah, and then also I've been learning about some of the plants, and so it's got me really writing like crazy. And
Oh, that's wonderful.
like I love publications like Orion.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of great. So that's like my dream to want to get published in that. But it's just it's like a second career now.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's so funny. So first of all, I'm a sage nut.
Are you? Oh, good.
I'm mad about sage.
There's a sage nut.
And-
Yeah.
and
That's sage too.
When I discovered this, I was like ecstatic.
Yeah.
Right? I'm like, I've never smelled anything
It's so
this beautiful.
It smells
And I
amazing.
noticed that if I had a little rash
Yeah, you
or
put it
something
on
like
there?
that, I could rub the oil on this, on the rash,
Yeah.
and it would often help.
You want to hear a secret? I burned myself 2 weeks ago, and I was there's one of these near my apartment. I don't have a garden. I live in a small apartment. But I would touch the flowers and then put some on, and it definitely helped it heal fast.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I love all of the sages have different oils.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
And many of them are edible also. I don't know about this guy. But
that I didn't know.
yes. Well, sage.
Well, is it related,
California sage.
Is it related to culinary sage?
Yes.
then?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So that's originally for the Mediterranean basin, right? But we have our own California sage as well.
So, may I give you my card?
I would love
My name
that.
is Darren.
Oh, hi, Darren. Oh, you have a great name.
Thank you.
Are you Italian?
I am.
So is she.
Brilliant.
Hi,
Paisan.
to meet you, Darren.
Nice to meet you.
Part
What
of
is your
the-
name?
Elisa.
Hi, Elisa.
Lisa, tell him how we met.
You mean here at the park?
Yeah, tell them our meet cute story.
Oh, okay. So we were closer to the entrance, and there's a Pacific wren who has kind of taken residence in a grove of bamboo, and we were both just mesmerized because his song is he's like a canary. He just belts it out, and he goes on and on. And yeah, we were both just standing there.
Well, and I said, do you know what kind of bird this is? And I knew she was going to be a friend of mine because I've become a lot more intentional about observation as a means to get some depth in the connection in the world around me.
Me too.
And it's funny because I've been a scientist, for over 20 years and studying science. And you forget how to actually observe things and actually pay attention because you're constantly doing like a million things at a time, right? And the same with medicine. We don't get time with patients to really sit and observe them.
Right.
Which is so much of what we need to do to figure something out.
We agree.
So I saw her and she was like patiently waiting and she had binoculars and I was like, okay, this girl knows about birds. And so I just started talking to her. That was amazingly a month ago. So every week, except for last week, for the last month, we've met and we've explored different parts of the garden. And she's like, we're on the same wavelength in terms of our interest. And today we did a little...
So, there was an example of beautiful first moves. I met two women, Elisa and Cogniscia. And Cogniscia is an oncologist, radiation oncologist, and has trained with neurosurgeons. And Elisa is a bird person, sometimes called a twitcher. And so we walked around, and oh my God, I haven't had an experience like this in a long, long time. it was so effusively exciting. And Cogniscia is staggeringly intelligent, and Elisa's much more soft-spoken. And we looked at birds, and we talked about the fact that an oriole's been sighted here in the place in the garden where I come, and we just had the most amazing little walk, which you may have heard traces of before I decided that it wasn't reasonable to try to record it all, because I don't think the mic would have picked it up. But there was an example of just how our orientation when we meet others can absolutely transform everything. I come here all the time, and I've never had an encounter like this. Though I have encountered other very insightful or intelligent people, Cogniscia's intelligence is like a force of nature. I don't remember someone that incredibly diversely educated and profoundly loquacious, which means to talk a lot. I mean, I thought I talked a lot. I'm rather timid compared to her. So, I'm not sure where I broke off in my wandering talk. I know I was talking about first moves and unity, and how maybe we have things backwards in terms of minds, in the sense that we think of people as having individual minds. But if you look very carefully at the character, we also saw a coyote, which I'm hearing right now. See if you can hear it. You see, when the sirens go, then the coyotes howl. So I think we have this backwards, and if we look at the characteristics of individual minds, we will find that vast portions of common people's minds are comprised of collective representations. Representations of what things are, what they're for, what they do, what they're called, that are inherited from the collectives, and this is no accident. This is evidence of the network I was speaking of that I call the Cogniscia. And so I suspect that if either we didn't learn language so early, which may be important because it seems that there are, well, it's a long topic, but humans have many life phases, and different phases of our lives incline us to be able to adopt specific skills. And it appears that language learning, it's not impossible to acquire language beyond childhood, but it seems very uncommon. And so what I'm trying to say is that our life experience as children inhibits many senses that would otherwise develop, and it shunts developmental resources into representational thought to such a severe degree that many of the... One moment, the siren's going by. Many of the faculties that would otherwise develop are severely inhibited or lost. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be developed, but one would have to wonder the same thing about them that we wonder about language. In which life phase are they most easily acquired, and is there a limit? In other words, there may be faculties that we have to activate when we're very young, or we will lose them. However, I suspect that the faculties that would be involved in mind sharing stay with us throughout our lives and are always accessible. It may just be that because language is fundamentally representational, we have to acquire it in specific phases of childhood, otherwise we perhaps lose the ability to acquire it, or that ability is severely limited. Many of us, I think, have had experiences, as I said, of mind sharing, and something which I'm hesitant to call telepathy. I want a better word, which is, I guess, why I'm calling it something else. But these experiences are most common in situations of deep intimacy with family members, loved ones, animals, perhaps plants. And intimacy is a fundamental component. Now, it may be possible for us to be generally intimate, but the contexts we normally find ourselves in are intrinsically conflicted. It's a little hard to pick up where I left off, but I'm working at it. I hope you'll bear with me. So, I spoke about how the categories inherit the errors of the supercategories, or what I would call the Uniphore. The Uniphore is what everything is, what we think of everything as being. And I was speaking about the necessity of incompleteness and including it in our ideas, our thought, our theories, our models, because although human intelligence appears advanced in certain domains, it's incredibly primitive in others. And we should recognize that so that we can learn to see into the aspects of our potential to which we've been blinded by techne. And language is part of that techne. In fact, one might say, well, earlier in the conversation I was wondering, I strongly suspect tool use came before language. Language was more of probably an adaptation to larger social groups, right? And maybe even distributed social groups, right? Social groups distributed over a broad area. But language is one of the first technologies, and it's an incredibly dangerous one. It's just too easy to think that once we know the name of something, we can now dismiss it. We don't have to pay attention anymore. My goodness. Meeting those two women was like meeting a thunderstorm particularly Cogniscia. That woman is just like a storming thunder cloud of incredible curiosity and wonder and intelligence. And I'm still sort of overwhelmed. But it was made possible because we all made first good moves together. There was trust and fascination and interest. And I opened the conversation with, have you seen any beautiful birds? That was my first move, I think, if I remember correctly. And of course there's a recording, so we'll find out. But we could easily have decided that either of us, any of us, right, could have decided, oh, this is dangerous, oh, it's the pandemic, oh, who's this man wandering around in the garden, is he a safe person to relate with? Just as children would, right? But we beautifully negotiated that and then had just a wonderful time together, for which I'm deeply grateful. It's incredibly refreshing for me to meet other adults who are fascinated by living beings and the possibilities of intelligence. And Cogniscia it was such a peculiar, it was almost like magic happened, because those two women together are different than either one of them alone. And us three together, we formed a unique little mini society for a time. And it's very uncommon that I meet adults that are so broadly curious and fascinated. And Cogniscia is a scientist who's also, a doctor, who's also deeply fascinated by living things and not merely the clinical intelligence is there, right? There's something deeper that she's reaching for and reaching back into in her life. And it's just beautiful. So it's getting dark now, and I've wandered far afield in the conversation. But that's okay. Not all of our wanderings come to nice, neat conclusions. But I want to encourage anyone who's listening to both pay attention, to sift the forms of intelligence that are common and find their jewels and leave the dross aside, and to look deeper into the nature of our awareness in our minds for the origins of the problems and opportunities that our peculiar kind of animal embodies and faces, particularly in our modern situation. And each of us has transited a number of life phases, and we've also transited a number of phases of the development of civilization in our lifetimes. And everything has sped up very dramatically over the past 50 years or less. It's sped up even faster in the past 10. And so in a sense, we've seen more development in some domains, while at the same time experiencing the loss of faculties and relationships and opportunities that were previously natural to us when the pace of life was much slower, as it was in my childhood. The frenetic pace of the mechanized world is a terrifying thing for any animal. And the aspects of our interiority that are sensitive and vulnerable, they have to shield themselves from that to survive. So to recover them, we must be passionately curious and also have space, right? Away from machines, away from the frenetic pace of civilization, away from news, away from media. We need quiet, contemplative space together to explore and rediscover the many faculties and assets of our humanity that have been either hidden, threatened, or driven into representations, transactions, and tokens. And it's my hope that we can all do this work together and continue to learn and grow and recover some of the most precious assets that are human incarnation. embodies. The moon is approaching fullness, perhaps 4 or 5 more days. There are many new birds in the garden, and I was lucky enough today to have an astonishing adventure with other humans here, which these days, I must admit, is relatively rare. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.